Russia is the aggressor. Russia occupies parts of Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia controls part of eastern Ukraine, and they've done so since 2014. Russia has the biggest land power in Europe. They have nuclear weapons. They have modernized and invested heavily in new modern military capabilities. So to say that Ukraine is a threat against Russia is to put the whole thing upside down.
Good morning and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. My guest today is Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO and the person who is at the epicenter of the crisis that's building on the Ukrainian border. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for joining us at this crucial moment for NATO and the West. Welcome to Washington Post Live.
Thank you so much for having me, David. It's a great pleasure to be with you today.
Before we start, I want to just remind our audience that if you want to join our conversation on this topic, please tweet any questions that you have to Post Live, and we'll try to take a look at them, and if we can, use some. Mr. Secretary General, I want to start with the situation near the border. Over the last 48 hours, have you and NATO seen any increases in Russian forces? And do you think, based on any intelligence precursors that you're seeing, that preparations for an attack are imminent, that they're moving things that they would need to use in a hurry?
So what we see is that the buildup continues with more and more combat-ready troops, with artillery, with armored vehicles, with more ammunition, with more fuel and supplies. And we also see that they are now starting to move into an increased Russian presence in Belarus. We see where they also will have planes and helicopters. So all of this together, of course, makes the warning time shorter and shorter. So we need to be prepared. There is a real risk for a new Russian invasion or some form of aggressive action against Ukraine. But at the same time, there's no certainty, and we continue to work for a political solution. Russia has a choice either to engage in a political dialogue with NATO and NATO allies, or to choose a confrontation. It's up to them.
We'll get to the diplomatic options in a moment, Mr. Secretary General. I want to just stay with the military situation on the border. Russia has scheduled exercises with Belarus from February 10 to 20, and many have speculated that that might be the moment in which the risk of invasion would be greatest. Do you share that assessment?
It is a serious risk that exercises like the exercise that is scheduled in Belarus can be used as a disguise for a military action invasion of Ukraine, because that has happened before. That was actually what happened back in 2014 when they annexed Crimea, and also when they went into and took control over Donbas, parts of eastern Ukraine. So Russia has used military exercises before as disguise, as a cover. They have also moved in time the strategic exercise. Normally that should have taken place several months ago, and now it will take place at the same time as the military exercise in Belarus. So when you see the military buildup that continues, when we see all the different exercises that are planned around Ukraine, and combine that with the threatening rhetoric, where they demand something from us they know they cannot get, and say there will be consequences, military technical consequences, as they put it, if we don't meet their demands. And then on top of that, we have the track record of Russia using force against Ukraine before. So military buildup, exercises, threatening rhetoric, and a track record, all of that together of course, make this a serious threat we have to take very seriously.
So let me ask you the question that I think the world most wonders about in terms of NATO, and that is what your response would be in the hours after a Russian attack. Ukraine is not a NATO member, and President Biden and others have been clear that NATO troops wouldn't be involved, but you would take actions to protect the alliance. Give us a sense of what they might be.
So we have made it very clear that there will be severe consequences for Russia, a high price to pay. That is partly economic and political sanctions against Ukraine that the NATO allies will impose. Partly the fact that since 2014, NATO and NATO allies have trained, supported the Ukrainian armed forces in many different ways, so they're much more capable of defending themselves now than in 2014. Much larger army, better equipped, better trained, better command. So the Ukrainians are able to actually also fight against invading Russian troops and forces. And thirdly, and that's that we will of course make sure that there is no misunderstanding about NATO's readiness, commitment to protect and defend all NATO allies. Ukraine is a partner, but for NATO allies we have, and we support them, but for NATO allies we have 100% security guarantees. Our collective defense clause, Article 5, an attack on one ally will trigger a response for the whole alliance. And therefore we have already increased our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance with more ships, with more planes. The US has put, for the first time in decades, aircraft strike group under NATO command. US, UK, France and others have made clear that they're ready to deploy troops and forces to the eastern part of the NATO alliance. And we have increased already the readiness of the NATO response force, in total around 40,000 troops that can be deployed on short notice. So we have done a lot to make sure that we deter any aggression against NATO allied countries, and that we're able to, as we have already increased our presence, but we're also able to further significantly increase NATO's military presence in the eastern part of the alliance if needed.
Mr. Secretary General, despite statements like the ones you've just made this morning, there has been some skepticism in different capitals about the seriousness of this crisis, led, not surprisingly, by Russia, which said today at the United Nations Security Council that the United States, and by extension NATO, was stoking hysteria. On Friday, as you know, Ukrainian President Zelensky complained that the US and NATO were needlessly scaring Ukrainians and suggested that there might be a political motivation for this crisis and the rhetoric coming out of Washington and other capitals. You've seen the intelligence. You're in the middle of this. What do you say to these arguments that this is politically motivated, stoking hysteria? What would the NATO Secretary General say in response?
I will say that we are receiving a lot of intelligence. A lot is also available from open sources, from commercial satellites, and so on. And there is no certainty about exactly what Russia will do, and most likely no final decision has been made. So in that sense, no one can predict exactly what will happen in the coming weeks and months. But what we do know is that there is a continued military buildup, the largest massing of forces in Europe since the Second World War. And these are combat-ready, heavy equipped forces, and we see them from the south, Crimea, then we see them in the east, in proper Russia, but also in Donbass, and we see, of course, now and more to the north in Russia, but also partly in Belarus. And there is no sign that this military buildup is slowing down. Actually, it continues. And then, so that's a fact. That's a reality. And then we can all read the very threatening statements and the kind of ultimatum Russia is putting to NATO, which demands things from us they know we cannot deliver, and then we have the track record, as I said, and then we have the exercises. So, well, we are describing the facts, and the reality is that Russia's military buildup is unexplained and unjustified. So it's for Russia to explain, and for Russia to de-escalate, and for Russia to engage in a serious political dialogue with NATO and NATO allies. We have conveyed clearly that we are ready to do so. When it comes to President Zelensky, I have regular contact with him, spoken with him many times over the last weeks and months, and of course they are also concerned, but they also now see the consequences of just the heightening tensions. For instance, when it comes to the financial flows out of Ukraine, and that's a serious concern. That's already kind of a price they have to pay for the Russian military buildup in and around Ukraine.
So Zelensky has spoken Friday and in recent days about his concern about panic and statements that could panic his population in Ukraine. But I want to ask you whether it's possible that the U.S. and NATO are getting their signals crossed in this sense. We want to scare and deter the Russians to prevent them from invading, and we want to reassure the Ukrainians, but you sometimes wonder if we're doing the opposite. We're scaring the Ukrainians and in some odd ways maybe reassuring the Russians. How would you react to that criticism?
That it would have been irresponsible if we didn't address the continued military buildup that has taken place over many weeks. If NATO didn't react to that at all, then I think it would have been justified to criticize us for being passive. We are, as I said, describing the facts, but we're also then conveying a message to Russia to deter them from using those forces. We are consulting very closely with Ukraine at many different levels, also here in Brussels. And we are describing a way out, providing Russia an opportunity to sit down. And we met recently in the NATO-Russia Council. We didn't agree, but at least that was a sign or a step in the right direction to de-escalate and to find a political solution. But again, for NATO not to respond to the biggest military buildup in Europe since the end of the Second World War, and actually this is also in Belarus and also not so far from NATO borders, that would have been impossible, especially since this buildup is met with direct threats, also threatening rhetoric towards NATO allies. They are asking us to give up core principles for NATO, the right for every nation to choose its own path, and the right for NATO to defend and protect all allies. They want actually also move out all troops and all infrastructure from all NATO allies that joined NATO after 1997, meaning almost half our members. There will be some kind of second-class members because we don't have the same right and a possibility to defend these allies. So there's no possibility, no option for NATO not to react, and we really try to be balanced. We convey a message of deterrence, but also a message of dialogue, and again, we really urge Russia to choose the path of dialogue.
Before we turn to diplomacy, Mr. Secretary General, I want to just ask you one more fundamental military question. You said that NATO is prepared for the worst. NATO is a military alliance that is protected by U.S. and other nuclear weapons. It's an alliance that absolutely guarantees the security of its members. What would NATO be prepared to do if this war spilled over the borders of Ukraine? For example, Poland is a close ally of Ukraine, and it's my understanding, I've written in my column, Poland is prepared to offer medical assistance to Ukrainians who were wounded in fighting. Suppose Russians chose to attack or block those pathways between Ukraine and Poland. Can you envision a situation in which NATO forces would have to get involved to protect Poland? And then the final question, how do you protect that from becoming an all-out crisis that could rise to the level of a nuclear confrontation?
So NATO is the strongest military alliance in the world and in history. We represent 50% of the world's military might and 50% of the world's economic might. And as long as we stand together, we are able to defend and protect all NATO allies against any threat. And to make sure that there is no room for miscalculation, misunderstanding about that, we have increased our presence, especially in the eastern part of the alliance. We have done that over the last weeks and months. For instance, with the US announcement of high readiness of US troops that can be put under NATO command, with the aircraft carrier under NATO command, and other allies are sending in capabilities, Spain, Denmark, and many other, the Netherlands and many others. But this is on top of what has taken place now over close to 8 years. Since 2014, NATO has implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. With battle groups, NATO-led battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance, in the Baltic countries and Poland, with air policing, increased naval presence, and a new command structure. And we have seen more US troops. European allies are extremely grateful for the fact that the US have, over the last years, deployed a new brigade in Europe, more pre-positioned equipment, more big exercises in the north and in the south and in the east of the alliance. And all of this sends a very clear message that we are ready to defend and protect all allies. And the purpose of that is to prevent exactly what you talked about, to prevent that Russia or any other potential adversary just tries to take control of any NATO territory, or because the consequences will be so devastating. So the purpose of NATO is not to provoke a conflict, it is to prevent the conflict. The purpose of deterrence is to deter aggression. And we have done so successfully for more than 70 years. During the Cold War, when tensions were even higher, and we had more troops and more armies lined up along the borders than we even have today. So this has worked for 70 years. It's going to continue to work as long as we continue to do what NATO has done, to invest more in defense. And that's also something we have seen in the last years. After many years of cutting defense spending, all European allies have actually increased defense spending every year since 2014, added together with Canada $260 billion extra US dollars since we made a commitment at the NATO summit in 2014 to start to increase defense spending. So all of this is there to prevent any aggression against any NATO allied country.
Obviously, the strength of this alliance lies in its unity. Some commentators in the last several weeks have expressed concerns about the unity of NATO, noting that on some issues, major countries like France and Germany are not in precise alignment with the United States. Do you have concerns as the Secretary General about NATO's unity?
So first, I think we have to distinguish between unity and then whether there are differences. NATO is an alliance of 30 allies from both sides of the Atlantic, with different governments and different capitals, different history, different political leaderships. And so of course there are differences and different opinions about many things. that has been the case in NATO since we were established, back to the Suez crisis in '56, or in the '60s when France decided to leave the military cooperation in NATO, or the Iraq War in 2003. So there are and will be and has been differences between NATO allies. But the strength of NATO is exactly as you said, our unity, meaning that we have always been able to unite around our core task, the core commitment, Article 5, that we are ready to protect and defend each other. And also over the last years, under different US administrations, we have seen not less, but more US presence in Europe. And for me, it's hard to see any stronger expression of allied willingness to protect and defend each other than we actually are standing up and doing more together. So yes, there are differences, but on the core message of the readiness to defend, we do that together. And now, for instance, Germany leads one of the battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance in Lithuania. Before 2014, we had no combat troops in the eastern part of the alliance. Now Germany is leading one of the combat-ready troops or battle groups in the Baltics. France has made it clear over the last weeks that they are ready, or days, that they are ready to deploy yet another battle group to Romania under NATO command. And so other allies are also stepping up and declaring willingness to provide forces to different NATO missions and operations. So on the main issue, the unity and the commitment to defend, there is absolutely unity in our alliance.
Mr. Secretary General, let's turn to diplomacy, which we all hope can be successful in this crisis. We've just learned within the last few minutes that Secretary of State Blinken will talk to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov tomorrow, if my information is correct, to continue the diplomatic dialogue. NATO received a detailed draft treaty from Russia back in December, and you submitted a detailed written response to that Russian document in the last several weeks. Tell us about how NATO responded to the Russian treaty in as much detail as you can.
The first thing we did was actually to invite them to a meeting in the NATO-Russia Council, and they accepted, which is a good sign, a first step, because Russia has refused to meet in the NATO-Russia Council for more than 2 years. We sat down, we had open, difficult discussions, but at the same time, that was exactly why the meeting and the discussions were so important. Second, I have conveyed the message to Russia and all the 30 allies. I actually invited them for a series of meetings to continue dialogue and to see and to look for a way, common ground and a way forward. And thirdly, as you said, we sent them last week a written response, written proposals. And that outlines topics and areas where we see room for common ground. So this is about partly the state of the NATO-Russia relationship, and this is about using the lines of communications we already have, but also to establish new lines, both for and strengthening civilian and military lines of communications. This is about re-establishing the diplomatic relationships between NATO and Russia, because they closed down our NATO office in Moscow and in Russian mission to NATO. We should re-establish those offices, and this is also about other ways of improving the kind of the institutionalized relationship between NATO and Russia. Then it's about NATO, European security, including the situation in and around Ukraine. They will also state clearly that, of course, we are ready to sit down and listen to Russian concerns, but we also state clearly that we will not compromise on some core principles, including the right for every nation in Europe or every nation to choose its own path. including whether or not it wants to be part of a alliance as NATO, and NATO's right to defend and protect all allies. We also identify arms control as an area where we can talk. Missiles, nuclear, we have seen that has worked before. For instance, the ban on all intermediate range missiles we had for many years, which was extremely important for Europe. We should re-engage in talks on how to impose limits on missiles and other weapon systems. Then transparency on military activities. This is very much illustrated now. They are going to have exercises in Belarus with tens of thousands of Russian troops, with advanced weapon systems, with missiles and so on. Of course, that is, we need transparency. We need mandatory inspections, and so far Russia has always denied that. So we need to strengthen the mechanisms for transparency on military activities. This is part of something that is called the Vienna document, negotiated within the OC framework, and also mechanisms for risk reduction to prevent incidents and accidents, and if they happen, make sure that they don't spiral out of control. So these are some examples of issues we have identified. We have put our proposals on the table on how we can sit down and address some of the Russian security concerns and reduce tensions and address issues of, for instance, offensive weapons, missiles. But this has to be balanced. It has to be reciprocal, and it has to be verifiable. But that kind of issues, we are absolutely ready to sit down and discuss.
And Secretary General, let me ask you whether there's anything in your written response that speaks to the fundamental Russian complaint that their security is threatened because the alliance is so close to their borders, and that asks for an ironclad guarantee that Ukraine would not be a member. You've made it clear, as has President Biden, that a guarantee like that is a non-starter. But in your response, did you, for example, reiterate the membership criteria for NATO, which by most people's judgment would mean that Ukraine would be a distant, if ever, likely member of the alliance? Anything like that that speaks indirectly to the fundamental Russian concerns?
So I think that confidentiality is a precondition for any diplomatic progress or success. So therefore, we have not publicized the document, because we are ready to sit down and talk in good faith, and also identify avenues. Some of these issues have to be addressed bilaterally, US, Russia, in what's called the strategic talks on, for instance, nuclear issues. But then, of course, from the US side, in very close consultation with NATO allies, as they have done again and again. Some may be discussed in the OC framework, and some may be discussed in the NATO-Russia Council. So different issues have to be addressed in different formats. I also think, for instance, that the Normandy format, where you have Germany and France, is also a format to, for instance, address some of the issues that are more specific on the situation in and around Donbass. Well, what we have made clear is that, of course, to become a NATO ally, you have to be NATO is for North America, US and Canada, and for European countries. That's enshrined in the Washington Treaty. So the first, what I say, threshold to pass is to be a European country. But second, you have to share our values: democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, and thirdly, you have to meet NATO standards. It has to in a way so strengthen transatlantic security. So therefore, when it comes to Ukraine, our focus has been and still is on reforms, on helping them to modernize the defense and security institutions, to meet NATO standards, to fight corruption. And this is the focus, and we have made that clear to Ukraine, but also, of course, to Russia, because this is well known that that's the focus of NATO. But there is a huge difference between discussing when Ukraine can be a member of NATO and to say that we should sign a legally binding treaty excluding any enlargement of NATO. Because that goes far beyond Ukraine. That includes, for instance, Finland and Sweden. And one of the things that I think we should all carefully note is that Finland and Sweden, countries which are now currently not applying for membership, they have called very clearly on NATO not to sign such a binding treaty. I spoke with the Swedish Prime Minister, Magdalena Andersson, and the Finnish President, Niinistö, and they both conveyed the same message, that for them to see that NATO signs a treaty that makes it impossible any time in the future, forever, for Sweden or Finland to join NATO would actually undermine their right to choose their own path. So this is about a fundamental right for all allies or for all countries to decide whether they want to belong to NATO or not, and that's for the aspirant countries and 30 allies to decide, no one else. That principle we will not compromise on.
So, Mr. Secretary General, we've run out of time. I am going to ask you to, in the briefest way, answer what I think of as the Dave Petraeus question posed to him as U.S. forces were heading into Iraq in 2003. Tell me how this ends.
I will not tell you that because there is too much uncertainty. What I can tell you is that we will stand united, NATO allies, both in our efforts to find a political solution, as we have done with our common positions, our common invitations to Russia, but also stand united if Russia once again chooses to use military force against a neighbor. United in our support to Ukraine, but also a valid partner, but also united in our rock solid and unwavering commitment to protect and defend all allies. And by doing that, we will deter any armed attack against a NATO allied country.
Secretary General, we are immensely grateful to you for spending this time with us to explain a crisis that has riveted the world's attention. Thank you for being with us today on Washington Post Live.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor.
So I hope you'll come to our upcoming programming. We've got a lot of interesting things on Ukraine and other issues ahead this week. Please go to WashingtonPost.com to look at that programming. Thank you for joining us for this special session with the NATO Secretary General.